This hit piece on Forspoken, masquerading as a review by Tom Marks of IGN, is a prime example of what happens when diverse voices are excluded and narratives are catered to the expectations of a white male audience. Tom's implicit biases are on display in 6 key ways: his tone towards Frey Holland, his loaded word choices, his dismissal without context, his lack of nuance and story critique, his overgeneralization and hyperbole, and his missing perspective of audience receptions. This is not a review. This is what happens when you give the mic to someone whose lens is so steeped in whiteness that their supposed objectivity collapses into prejudice that reveals itself most clearly when the subject is a black woman protagonist in a medium still dominated by white male expectations. Tom is the deputy review editor at IGN who enjoys puzzle games, puzzle platformers, and an eclectic mix of genres that don't involve puzzles or platforming. It's no wonder his review veers into ignorance and bias, because he wasn't equipped to understand the genre or the groundbreaking weight of representation within it. His review begins.
Okay, stop me if you've heard this one before. A down-on-their-luck orphan has their life turned upside down when they get whisked away to a fantastical new world. There they suddenly have magical powers and must reluctantly rise to become the hero its people need to stop an evil threat. If that sounds like every fantasy book you've ever forgotten you read, it's probably because Forspoken is a remarkably generic RPG, from its bland story to its lifeless open world.
Yes, we've heard this before. It's one of the most common narrative tropes in gaming, but what Tom Marks leaves out is this: never before has a black woman been the lead character in a video game experiencing this journey. That matters, because we've played this exact art countless times with white male protagonists, and no one calls their very existence a crime.
The newest action RPG from Square Enix puts you in the brooding shoes of Frey Holland, a well-acted but largely unlikable New Yorker.
Calling the black female lead largely unlikable is an unusually harsh framing for a review. When white male protagonists in generic RPGs fall flat, they're called bland or forgettable, but when it's a black woman, she's framed as a problem, not flawed, not complicated, just unlikable. That's not critique, that's a stereotype. It echoes the tired tropes that have dogged black women for centuries: angry, unpleasant, and difficult. He may as well have called her uppity.
That means their snippy banter comes off as obnoxious rather than endearing. Frey is surprisingly vocal about her disdain for most of the tasks you're asked to complete.
Words like snippy, obnoxious, disdain are not neutral. They pathologize her emotions. Male characters in the same setup, like Kratos in God of War, get praised as gruff, witty, sardonic, even endearing. But when it's a black woman, suddenly it's obnoxious. That's not objectivity, that's bias bleeding through word choice. Why wouldn't she be? This is standard fare for isekai stories. The protagonist resists, lashes out, struggles against what's been forced on them. But in Frey's case, it makes even more sense. She's been alone her whole life, scraping by, and now she's literally chained to a voice on her wrist. Anyone else gets called relatable in that position. She gets called snippy. Instead of asking whether the writing gave Frey reasons to be abrasive, homelessness, trauma, being dropped into a hostile magical world, Tom Marks flattens her into one word: unlikable. That lack of context is almost criminal. Video games are saturated with white male protagonists, and because we've been conditioned to see their struggles over and over, they don't need context. We accept them automatically. But when a black woman finally takes center stage, suddenly her survival instincts are dismissed as attitude. For Tom to write this without context isn't just lazy, it's bias on the page.
Forspoken's world and story are about as bland as they come.
Tom Marks calls this the real crime, but fails to acknowledge what actually mattered. Forspoken was a unique, unprecedented step. Square Enix putting a black woman front and center in a AAA fantasy RPG. That alone should have framed the conversation. The same critique could be leveled at countless games with white male protagonists trudging through the exact same narrative beats, but in those cases, critics bend over backwards to excuse it as classic, familiar, or genre staples. Here it becomes a crime?
Equal parts predictable and forgettable, and mostly told through exposition dumps between large stretches of open-world exploration.
On top of that, the characters in Forspoken are established not just through dialogue, but through performance, lore, and world building spread throughout the game. Ignoring that nuance is sloppy at best, but what really exposes the bias is how he erases the cultural significance of Frey's mere existence in this space. Her presence was history, and his silence on that says more than his words ever could.
Its parkour system is also satisfying enough despite the scenery you're running through being about as picturesque as a bowl of rocks with an Instagram filter slapped on it.
This isn't critique, this is performance. Hyperbolic snark meant to entertain the reader with disdain, not to actually engage the game on its own terms. So what is this line really doing? It is an observation, it's creative license taken for the sake of ridicule. When paired with his earlier hostility towards Frey, the review stops looking like balanced criticism and starts reading like a hit piece dressed up as witch. The review dismisses Forspoken as generic, but what Tom Marks never even touches is how many players, especially black women, celebrated finally seeing themselves as the lead in a fantasy RPG. That absence isn't a small oversight. It exposes the narrowness of his lens. He judged the entire game only by his own preferences, and by extension, the preferences of the white audiences he writes for. Yes, maybe it felt generic to people who've been represented endlessly, but for the people of the global majority, for those who have never been centered in this genre, Frey Holland was a milestone. Erasing that truth is exactly what happens when gaming journalism keeps centering white perspectives and calling it objectivity. This IGN review of Forspoken is not just a bad review. It's a case study in what happens when diverse voices are excluded from the room. Our perspectives shape what we notice, what we value, and what we dismiss. White gamers represented endlessly for decades may be bored by familiar tropes, but for those finally seeing themselves in the story, it's not boring, it's powerful. We need more diverse reviewers in gaming journalism, because when the only perspectives that get amplified are steeped in whiteness, objectivity isn't just compromised, it's hijacked, and the result, as we see here, is bias masquerading as critique.